A proud DC Bar member benefit, LawPay makes it easy to securely accept payments anytime from anywhere. Their proprietary technology prevents commingling of earned and unearned funds and protects your trust account against any third-party debiting, ensuring compliance with ABA and IOLTA guidelines. Schedule a demo at lawpay.com/DCBar and see why LawPay is trusted by 50,000 law firms. MyCase is a top-rated end-to-end legal case management software that helps firms run efficiently from anywhere, provide exceptional client experience, and easily track firm performance. Streamline day-to-day firm processes in one easy-to-adopt solution. Lead tracking, client intake, case management, e-signature, billing payments, and more. DC Bar members are eligible for a 10% lifetime discount. Start your free trial, no credit card required, today.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Brief Encounters. It's great to have you joining us today. And today we have a very special guest with us. His name is Dennis Boyle, and he's an expert on international criminal law. And we're going to be talking about war crimes, which is a very hot topic right now. So thank you for being here, Dennis.
Thank you.
Before we get started, tell us a little bit about yourself and what brought you to knowing about and working on international criminal law.
Sure. I've been a lawyer now for over 35 years. I actually began my career as a Navy J.A.G advocate during the first Persian Gulf War. One of my primary duties during that war was working with rules of engagement. Certainly, we were trained on the law of armed conflict at that point in time. After leaving the Navy, I became a state and federal prosecutor before becoming a defense attorney. But I've always had an interest in international law. I was admitted to practice before the International Criminal Court in 2008. I've represented a number of accused war criminals over the years. So it's always been something that's been very important to me and something I've taken a lot of time and effort to try to understand.
Well, that is fantastic. And it's really interesting that you got to be a JAG during the first Gulf War, during the Persian Gulf War, Desert Storm, because I believe that historians will tell us that that's the moment when the discussion on proportionality began for IHL, like the moment where the precision-guided munitions allowed for the first time to actually start thinking of proportionality in the ways we do today, where targeting is way more precise. So let me ask you then, we are in a situation, there's a big armed conflict going on in Europe for the first time in nearly 30 years. And the question in everybody's mind is, how do we prosecute the violations of the law of war, the war crimes that we're seeing reported on the news? And it's pretty obvious in most cases that some of these situations are suspect. They're not, we don't know all the facts, but we can intuit a few of them and imagine that there are war crimes happening. So take us back a little bit in history, and how did this even become an issue, the idea of prosecuting war crimes?
Prosecuting war crimes goes back quite a bit further than I think a lot of people realize. The Liber Code in the 1860s during the American Civil War was part of, sort of a first attempt to create a concept of war crimes. There were people that were tried for war crimes during the American Civil War. After World War I, the Treaty of Versailles did contain provisions for war crimes trials, although those never occurred. And then after World War II, we had the Nuremberg trials, which were really the first international effort to try war crimes before an ad hoc body. That process of trying war crimes before ad hoc bodies continued up until recently, the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda. And that, I think, has set the international pattern for the prosecution of war crimes. In the 1990s, we had the International Criminal Court that was created. The U.S. is not a party to that court, but that is the first standing court, international court, to prosecute war crimes. But I think it's important to remember also that war crimes are frequently prosecuted in national courts. And certainly Russians that commit war crimes on Ukrainian soil could be prosecuted in Ukrainian national courts.
Tell us a little bit more about how that works, because I think that's a concept that people are not familiar with. They think of it as being always international.
Yeah, I think that most war crimes trials in history probably have not been international. When I was a child, I remember the My Lai massacre in Vietnam that was committed by US soldiers. They were actually prosecuted, at least some of them, in military court martials. Lieutenant Calley, who led the war crime, was sentenced to life in prison, as I recall. I know he was subsequently pardoned, but that was an example of war crimes being prosecuted in military court martial. That, I think, has happened in every war since World War II, at least. National courts can also prosecute war crimes and do prosecute war crimes. The actions taken, or at least the actions that appear to have been taken by Russian military personnel, appear to violate war crimes. They are committed on the territorial jurisdiction of Ukraine, and to the extent that Russians are arrested by Ukrainian authorities or they're taken into custody as POWs and evidence develops that they did commit war crimes, they could certainly be tried by Ukrainian courts.
So we see there is this possibility of trial by domestic courts, both from the party where, like, soldiers from where they're from, like, Russia could do it, or Ukraine because they've captured them. We know that combatants tend to have the combatant privilege, but they can be prosecuted for their war crimes by the side holding them. Tell us what constitutes war crimes, because it's not everything under the sun, right? There are certain qualities to something being a war crime.
There are, yes, war crimes is a concept. The law of armed conflict is what we used to call it in the Navy. Military operations have to be conducted pursuant to standards. Those standards are contained in the Geneva Conventions. But for example, you cannot target civilians. You cannot target places of historical or cultural significance. You cannot target soldiers or sailors or Marines or airmen after they have surrendered. Once they're surrendered, they're required to be cared for and kept in custody. They can't be forced to work or to engage in other sorts of activity. And essentially, they're required to be held until the end of hostilities, at which time they're supposed to be repatriated to the country that they're from. Proportionality, something you mentioned earlier on, is another war crime that I think we're going to see with increasing frequency. And one of the problems I think the Russians are going to face if there are war crimes trials in Ukraine. You can't destroy a city because somebody in the city has a rifle and they're hostile to the invading force. You can't destroy an apartment building because somebody took a shot from it. So the military force that's used has to be related to a military target, and it has to be proportional to the mission that needs to be accomplished.
Yes. So you said you've worked at the ICC, right? You've worked with defendants at the International Criminal Court. I think Americans are not very familiar with this court and its jurisdiction and how it can assert jurisdiction over defendants. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, I think that's a frequent issue that's frequently misunderstood. A good question. I'm glad you asked me about that. The Rome Statute is a treaty, and signatories to that treaty establish the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court. There's two concepts. One is territorial jurisdiction. The International Criminal Court has jurisdiction over the territories of countries that are signatories to it. It has jurisdiction over matters referred to it by the International Criminal Court, and that is the jurisdictional concept. So with respect to the Ukraine has accepted the jurisdiction of the ICC over certain matters which have happened in Ukraine, particularly since 2014 and the Russian invasion of eastern Ukraine and the annexation of the Crimea. That acceptance of jurisdiction would, at least at this point, appear to grant the court jurisdiction over the current events that are happening all over Ukraine. Certainly, a defense counsel defending people charged before the ICC might raise that jurisdictional issue, but I suspect they would lose that at this point in time. The other issue that's I don't think Americans understand, and there's really not an American counterpart, is the issue of admissibility. In order for the ICC to have jurisdiction over a matter or to try a matter, it needs to not only have territorial jurisdiction, it has to be a matter that's admissible. The International Criminal Court is a court of last resort. So it does not try matters if there's another national court available to try those matters. The question of admissibility in this case is whether the Russian court system is sufficiently competent to handle these war crimes allegedly committed by their forces. I suspect the Russians would argue that they are competent. I think, though, that probably the case would be determined to be admissible. I'm thinking specifically of the fact that we have very, very senior leaders in the Russian government saying that there were no atrocities, that nothing has ever occurred, that all of these were staged. I think that undercuts any argument that the Russians could fairly and impartially try the cases.
Yeah, absolutely. What you mentioned brought to mind something else, and it's I believe that the ICC was looking into war crimes in Afghanistan as well, and some people believe it could possibly rope in U.S. forces into that sphere, and that's not very welcome here. So how do we balance that? I think this is a policy question at the end of the day. How do we balance what we think is happening in Ukraine with the possibility that the ICC may be looking at situations that occurred in Afghanistan or they might have decided there was nothing there. I haven't fully followed it after I first heard about it, but it's something that just came to mind hearing you mention this.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point to talk about. The ICC did open a matter in Afghanistan. Afghanistan is a signatory to the Rome Statute and does have territorial jurisdiction over Afghanistan. However, there were threats from the U.S. government to sanction ICC judges and other ICC prosecutors and officials. Ultimately, the ICC determined that the case was not admissible, in that the United States does have a capable legal system and is capable of fairly and impartially trying allegations of war crimes. And the U.S. has tried people for war crimes in both Afghanistan and Iraq.
We're spending a lot of time talking about prosecuting Putin for what he's doing. And I think we don't spend enough time talking about prosecuting George W. Bush for the Iraq War.
That was one of the questions I pondered, is why are we talking about Russian war crimes when we didn't talk about American war crimes in Iraq and Afghanistan? And I think there's some significant difference. The actions in Iraq, when George W. Bush invaded Iraq, were arguably supported by United Nations resolutions. They were conducted more in accordance with the laws of war than Russian actions have been. There was a significant diplomatic effort by the United States prior to the entry into military operations against Iraq in 2003. With respect to the Russians, it's much more of a naked aggression. There's no international support, no international body that has supported what the Russians have done. And the Russian way of conducting war is just extremely brutal. There's a lot of investigation that needs to be done yet, but it appears at this point, at least, that we have Russians targeting clearly civilian targets, hospitals, schools, other places that have no apparent military significance. Those would be clear violations of the laws of war. Now, once the investigation starts, once there is an investigation, perhaps there are targets of military relevance close to these, but at this point, it doesn't appear that way.
That makes a huge difference, I guess, at the end of the day. So my question then is, if we start looking at Ukraine and the situation that's happening there, recently I heard from Ukrainian politicians like President Zelensky talking about some of the acts that have been committed constitute genocide. And I think there's a tendency to think of genocide as just the worst of the war crimes or the worst of everything. And so everybody wants to put that label on things when it may not necessarily be what's happening. What's your thought on that?
I think you're exactly correct. First of all, I would say there appears to be significant evidence that the Russians are engaged in mass murder. They are involved in the most serious of war crimes. I don't think there's any question about that. However, saying that they're engaged in genocide appears to be a bit of a stretch at this point. The genocide is the intent to eliminate a certain population based upon race or culture, religion, something of that nature. It's difficult to say that the Russians are trying to eliminate Ukrainians as a race at this point in time or as an ethnicity. Again, there may be evidence that turns up during further investigation that would indicate that there is a genocide going on. But at this point, I would say that There's certainly mass murder. There's certainly war crimes. I don't know that I would conclude there's a genocide yet. And if I could just turn that on its head for a second, one of Putin's justifications for going into Ukraine was the assertion that the Ukrainians were engaged in genocide against Russian-speaking people in Ukraine. I think that's completely preposterous, but again shows how a politically charged word like genocide can be used to maybe detract from serious violations of the laws of war that don't rise to the level of genocide.
And what would be the distinction, you think, like if you can't put the label of genocide on something, what could you do that creates that type of shock, because I think people really react strongly when you hear genocide. It's like, yeah, this is the worst of the worst, but what else could there be that delivers that impact? Because I think war crimes, just loosely categorized, might not be, just doesn't have that sense, that something really grave happened here.
Yeah, I understand that. I think mass murder would be an accurate title to use and something that may motivate people as much as genocide. But the wanton and needless killing of large numbers of people, the destruction of cities and towns, is among the worst of war crimes, regardless of what you call it.
Yeah, thinking of cities being destroyed, we're seeing destruction in a way that maybe we've only seen in Syria recently. And before that, we really have to look back at World War II and maybe the Spanish Civil War, which also, when you think about it, we can think of it as an analogous moment, I guess. World War II gave us the concept of crimes against humanity. And I was wondering if you're seeing anything, like just what we can see in the news that you think, well, maybe we could be talking about this.
Well, yes, I think that the killing of civilians, to a certain extent, this goes beyond the killing of people. The Russians are rounding Ukrainians up, they're torturing Ukrainians, they're summarily executing Ukrainians, they're killing Ukrainian children, and they appear to be doing all of this intentionally. So I think these are all crimes against humanity. I think there are allegations of rape being used for political purposes, and I think these are all quintessential crimes against humanity that ought to be prosecuted as well.
We're facing the usual triad, right, of war crimes, crimes against humanity. Worst case scenario, we might start seeing acts of genocide, because at the end of the day, if what the Russians are trying to do is what we're hearing in the news recently about controlling certain regions that they consider to be predominantly Russian, we could be seeing something like what happened in Srebrenica, right, during the war in the former Yugoslavia, which is having pockets of other people inside territories that are mostly, here it would be Russian. In that case, it was mostly Serbian territories, but you had pockets of Bosnian Muslims, right? All this to say, yeah, we could get to see all those three crimes, but the ICC statute, the Rome statute, added a new crime a few years back, and that is the crime of aggression. And I think when we talk about Vladimir Putin, who is the person that's in everybody's mind when we think about this war, what do you think? Do you think we could see in an ideal world a prosecution on that side? And what does it constitute to commit a crime of aggression?
A crime of aggression is, as you pointed out, a relatively new law in the ICC. However, aggression actually finds its origin in the Nuremberg trials after World War II. The key concept for the crime of aggression is policy-making authority. In order to be convicted of a crime of aggression, you have to be at the senior level of the policy structure, actually making the decision to engage in aggressive warfare. So the crime of aggression wouldn't apply to Russian soldiers. It wouldn't apply to even Russian generals. It would apply to Vladimir Putin. It would apply to his inner circle. And you asked about an ideal world, so I'll stick with an ideal world for the moment and say in an ideal world, I would think Putin would be prosecuted and convicted for the crime of aggression.
Yes, and it's always an ideal world, right? We don't know what will happen. But there's something else that came to mind just as we were talking, and it's when people talk about some people talk about the war in Ukraine, and that includes American scholars. They look back at 2014 and they think, well, we're not only seeing really an international armed conflict in terms of Common Article 2 of the four Geneva Conventions, right? But we are probably also witnessing some form of non-international armed conflict between some Ukrainians of Russian descent, if you will, or presumably, right? People who were running the breakaway republics, proto republics, whatever you want to call them, in the East. And so that is a space where we could actually see prosecutions, don't you think?
Yeah, I think I understand where you're headed. The law of war, separates people into combatants and non-combatants, and then there are legal and illegal combatants. If it's not an international conflict, then the laws of armed conflict don't apply, and they're not entitled to the same immunities that the soldiers would be. So they could.
But they could be under customary international law and Common Article 3, right? I mean, those rules would apply, just you'd have to do the customary international law analysis, like the ICTY did for some of the situations.
Probably the prosecution authorities in Ukraine would be the ones who would do that analysis. But, is this armed conflict or is this criminal activity? I think a lot of Ukrainians would probably see it as treason, wouldn't they?
I imagine, right? But at what point does the conversation about the organization and intensity of the conflict comes in? And like once you start having that conversation, you can probably be in a situation of non-international conflict. I think that many people in Ukraine would have agreed that there was some sort of armed conflict happening on their eastern border before the Russians invaded. And you know that in Congo, we'll see that where there's like, in DRC, over the past 20 years or more, we've seen like all sorts of conflicts coexisting. Like that can happen.
Correct.
But I agree with you. If there's a prosecution of the Ukrainians are definitely the best placed people, but
I think I agree with you. I think that, if we were to analyze this objectively, we would say this is an armed conflict. It's similar to the conflict in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And the ICC has asserted jurisdiction over there. So, yeah, I think that, it is perhaps an internal armed conflict.
Yeah, it's like one of the challenges of war, right? I keep coming back to this as I watch the news. It's that there's always more to the conflict than you first see at the top. We're seeing what the Russians are doing, but there are other things happening. And as the war evolves, we may start seeing more proxies acting on behalf of Russia and things of that sort. So I think it'll be an interesting and complicated issue for attorneys and for the court down the line. So what do you think will actually happen? Where do you see this going? And I'm not saying about, will Russia win or lose, but rather, where do you see international justice going in the next year and then after the war ends?
Oh, if I could predict the future, I'd probably be retired and a millionaire now. But I think that there are a lot of interesting things we should consider. War is fundamentally a political activity. At some point in time, diplomats and politicians are going to be working to end that war. And it will probably be ended through some sort of agreement. I imagine the Russians will push strongly for immunity from any war crimes prosecutions in that agreement. I fear that might be how this ends, that there'll be a treaty and it will be agreed in that treaty that nobody will be prosecuted. Of course, we have the example of Milosevic and the former Yugoslavia. He was indicted by the ICTY. I remember when he was indicted, I thought that was absolutely ridiculous. There was no way he was going to ever face justice. And then 2 years later, a new government turned him over to the ICTY for trial. I think that's another possibility in this case. I think there could be a new Russian government. It's possible that Putin doesn't survive this. And the new Russian government, if it wants to make amends, if it wants to correct the errors of the past, if it wants to get out from under sanctions, they may be willing to turn Putin and his inner circle over to some ad hoc committee or even the ICC for trial. But at this point, I'm not hopeful that we're going to actually see a reckoning at the highest levels. I think it's likely that we'll see prosecutions of lower level people in Ukraine, but I think Putin is likely to escape.
On that note, I think we'll wait and see, right? But I really appreciate you making the time to be here with us today and chat about this situation, about war crimes. And I think it's been an insightful conversation, and I really appreciate your time. Do you have any final word, anything you'd like to leave us with?
I would just urge people to keep informed about what's going on, to learn more about the ICC and what it does and what its jurisdiction is. And I thank you for your excellent questions in this matter.
This episode of Brief Encounters was brought to you in part by our sponsors LawPay and MyCase. Find out how these solutions can work for you by visiting lawpay.com and mycase.com. For more information, check out the description of this episode.